this being, well, beginning July 1st, or beginning today, last week. I remember 5 years ago kind of thinking that, starting this module, and I had just become rector 6 months before, but had not done seminar information before. And so I was very eager. Bishop Cousins preceded me as interim rector at St. Paul. And as soon as I got there, he said, well, you need to do this program down in Florida. And it was a great gift for me to do that, because just to learn a lot, to make connections, help me grow in confidence, I think. So just I'm excited for you, especially those of you who are starting this journey, not only here, but maybe even in the assignment. So it really is a great gift. Looking back, though, I kind of want to talk, I mean, certainly I'll give a few examples of kind of cover the talk here around being rector, but kind of the main thing I'm going to focus on here just goes back to my own law studies and then working in the Curie in Omaha. I realize I'm kind of on maybe the older end of many of you, but if you can think back to the Jubilee year 2000, so that's when I went to Rome and studied majority in canon law. Very exciting time in the church. You had the Jubilee year, and I remember going to many liturgies with John Paul II. There was just this springtime of Christian life and things that he spoke so eloquently about, and a great enthusiasm for the church. And then in 2002, again, some of you may not remember this part as well, but George White called it the long Lent of 2002, and that was when the sex abuse scandal broke out in Boston. And so we were just finishing up, meaning my classmates and I were just finishing that spring. And I remember, news was, believe it or not, there was only dial-up internet, and we had to pay per minute. So there was no broadband, there was no Wi-Fi. You had a phone and a modem, and if you were willing to sort of pay, you could, download the articles of what was going on. There was maybe one English-speaking newspaper, but obviously news traveled. But it's like every day there would be another horrible story at breakfast, and it just kind of got worse and worse. And then pretty soon all the cardinals from America were summoned Rome, and I remember pictures of the sort of the motorcade of the cardinals arriving to meet with John Paul II, and nobody knew what was happening. It was like the church is changing radically in our country. We're overseas, and we're not quite sure what this all means. During the final exams was the spring bishops meeting. Normally, Bishop would tell us this, right? That's kind of a lighter meeting in the spring, and it moves around. Well, this happened to be in Dallas, and so that's how we get the Dallas Charter. It was the next time the bishops were going to meet, and so instead of having a lighter meeting to have some fraternal time among bishops, it was a very heavy meeting and hastily crafted what we now know as the Dallas Charter. And then we were all going back to chanceries, most of us. So if you ever want a job security, being a canon lawyer in 2002 was good job security. So there was plenty of work, because you came back and suddenly it was safe environment policies and establishing review boards and file reviews. I remember we had to go through every priest personnel file, and this happened all over the country, and kind of combing all the files and what was missed and what wasn't acted upon and what do we need to turn over. And obviously the church is still dealing with that, but we're in a far better place today, some 20 years ago. But it was a very difficult time. And I could speak about many examples, but I don't know, how helpful it would be. But I remember at one point, a couple years into this, Father Horn was my spiritual director. And I just remember being very unhappy and making a retreat, and then finally kind of asking the question, how did I get here? Like, Lord, what do you do? Like, this is not at all what I sort of imagined, priesthood would be, kind of dealing in all of this stuff. How did I get here? What happened? And again, in that process, I think of just sort of relating to the Lord. He begins to lift burdens and invites us to deeper communion. But it was just kind of a difficult time for many. And I think another question that came to mind that maybe is pertinent for this group, and certainly now as rector, sometimes you'd go through these files and we'd say, how did this guy get ordained? Again, I don't want that to sound too harsh or negative, but when you would see the aftermath and then you would see warning signs, you say, well, what happened? And I say that with a little trepidation now being a rector. And one of my fears is like one of my guys is going to do something stupid, and end up in the news. And I know wouldn't be anyone's personal responsibility, right? People have their own agency, but there's kind of a responsibility you have when you're in formation. And I think all of you as formators feel that too. You
we want the best for our men, and we want them to flourish. We want them to come alive. But we have to be attentive to the issues that they bring and create a space where real stuff can be dealt with. Because if it's not dealt with in seminary, weird stuff comes out later. And I think we've seen kind of the worst of it again. And I'm not trying to say that every difficult issue turns into, abuse of a minor, but that's just something kind of seared a bit into my memory. So to look to our conversations today, we heard last night, I think, a beautiful introduction on accompaniment, and we thought it helpful kind of as a team to start off these talks on accompaniment with getting into this question about what is the role of a formator, and to dive into a little bit about the internal and external fora. So I'm going to be doing a fair amount of principles this morning, and I apologize, it'd be kind of content heavy, and then hopefully be a little more practical this afternoon, but also, again, a fair amount of content. But we just really want to, at least on the front end of this, give a deep dive kind of into what are these canonical principles, so that we can then kind of move forward with sort of a confidence that we're moving in accord with the church's understanding of how this works. If I think about my own time in seminary formation, I've been ordained 27 years now, and I had a beautiful experience in seminary. It wasn't perfect by any means. I went to the Josephina, but I had a wonderful formation director, now retired Bishop Tom Olmsted, wonderful holy priest, had very good spiritual directors. So my own personal experience on the whole was very positive, and I think fruitful and good conversations. And I'm still close to Bishop Olmsted and still keep in touch with him. But there were certainly classmates of mine or others who very much had, I think Bishop kind of alluded to this last night, the sort of the good cop, bad cop. You say one thing to the formator, you say another thing, the real story to the spiritual director. Or the other attitude would be, guys that say, well, just keep your head down, don't say anything, don't make any waves, punch the ticket, do what you're supposed to do, and you'll get ordained. If you kind of raise your head, if you raise your hand, if you speak too much, it's not going to go well. And so that was certainly, I think, with some men around, and I think has been sort of part of seminary experience in a lot of places over the years. Again, I think much, much better today than it was 30 years ago. My own experience of young people, and Father Horn mentioned before seminary, I did college ministry in Omaha, is that young people, and I think seminarians would sort of in that generation, they very much want to be known. They want to be heard, they want to be received. And I think we heard some examples already to that. They want to be honest and transparent. And part of our job, I think, is just to kind of create that space to allow them to be known. I think that's part of the deep desire of every heart. So if we can work to create that atmosphere of trust, then I think that our seminarians will want to share with us what is most important to them. At the same time, we do have to pay attention to the different roles. And there are roles, and we'll go to a lot of the details here today, between a spiritual director and a formator, so we can just kind of move in confidence and know why we have these different roles, what these distinctions are, and also what they aren't. So again, my goal this morning is kind of three main points. The first would be to take a look at Canon 220. So just kind of imagine a little canon law class here this morning on Canon 220. The second will be to look at issues of confidentiality around psychological testing. There will be a whole nother module on psychology, but I think the principles here really interplay pretty tightly with the internal external fora. So I think it's helpful to just kind of look at some of those questions. And then finally, to do a little bit, more than a little bit, but a little dive into what the words mean, internal, external fora, both in the, I would say, kind of the original meaning of the term, as well as kind of the expanded meaning, which is what we often use today. And then again, this afternoon, we'll try to apply all these principles to the different roles of formator, spiritual director, rector, psychologist, and kind of begin to see what are some of the particular nuances around all these issues. All right, sound good? All right, so let's dive in here. So Canon 220, if you follow the notes here, I tried to give a fairly detailed outline so you won't have to hopefully take too many notes here. So this is the canon. No one is permitted to harm illegitimately the good reputation which a person possesses, nor to injure the right of any person to protect his or her own privacy. And the Latin word there, I'll get into that in a minute here, which in English we translate as privacy is intimitatem. So there's sort of two parts to this. The first part of the canon is basically a repeat of the 1917 code, and it has to deal, in the earlier code, it dealt with a section on penal law. If you if you injure somebody's good reputation, you could be subject to some kind of remedy. Harm that person's reputation. The second part, the right to protect one's own privacy, is entirely new. So that was never before sort of named explicitly in law as a right that each person has. By the way, this canon is for the rights and obligations of all the Christian faithful. So this isn't just dealing with seminarians, but this is a canon that applies to everybody in the church. What's interesting, I think, though, on that second part is that it is entirely new. It was not in the previous code. The earlier code had sort of an implied right to privacy, and some examples would be in religious law. For example, there was a canon that prohibited a superior from demanding or forcing a manifestation of conscience of a subject. There was a canon about letters or correspondence. A superior couldn't sort of force somebody to turn over their mail or their private correspondence. So there are canons implying a right to privacy for religious, but it was never kind of named explicitly as a right until the 83 code. So the source of this, interestingly, sort of two sources. One would be Vatican Council II. Of course, we know that the new code largely is a product of the Second Vatican Council. John the 23rd not only called for an ecumenical council, he also called for a new code of canon law. And so in many ways, we shouldn't be surprised when we read the fonts of the canons that we're going to find documents of the council. So one of them was Gaudium et Spes, and I gave the quote here on number 26. It says that he ought, therefore, to have ready access to all that is necessary for living a genuinely human life. For example, the right to act according to the dictates of one's conscience and to safeguard his privacy and rightful freedom, even in matters of religion. So again, Vatican II here is trying to talk about what a human person needs to flourish, and these would be the kinds of things that somebody needs. What's interesting is if you dig a little deeper, where did the Council Fathers get that language? Interestingly, a lot of it came surprisingly from the UN, from the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. And if we think back to 1948, that was just, of course, in the wake of the Second World War. The world was at war. There was many abuses, horrific abuses against human life and dignity. Obviously, think of Nazi Germany, and before that, World War I. So there was just that horrible sort of bloody century. And the UN, I think, was trying to sort of bring nations together and articulate what are some basic principles that we can all agree on that are just inherent to the human person. And the Council Fathers even took some of those points, including this idea of a right to privacy. But what's interesting is when you do a little more of a word study here, and I think this is important for us, in Gaudium et Spes, the language there was that one has a right to a private life, to protect a private life, a vita privata. So this sense of, that was just language chosen by the Council Fathers. It was a private life, but there was a definite change in the 83 code, even though we call that privacy. And the word that was chosen in the codal revision process was intimitatem, or intimitas to be the nominative. And it has to deal with the intus means inside. So think intestines or intimate or intimacy, things that are interior to one's person. And so I think the intentional shift there was very important because the church doesn't want to legislate and say, you have a right to a private life, meaning, I think you're in the worst example of this would be maybe a priest who sort of has the double life. Well, here's my life as a priest, but this is kind of my second life. This is my private life, as if there's no kind of integration between the two. And in fact, I think when you get into that kind of language, that's sort of where we ended up with a lot of problems in the church. But one's interior, one's intimacy, one's heart, one's core, one's conscience, we might say, there is certainly a right that I can have a right to an interior life that isn't going to sort of be unjustly exposed to the world. And so I think very intentionally, I think when the lawyers kind of got at it and thought about this a little bit more, we shifted from protecting a private life, which again, I think is open to misinterpretation and problematic, to rather it's a right to one's interior freedom and intimacy within his core. So that's sort of the language we have now. we notice that this canon is not absolute, and so there's always going to be, qualifiers to this. The one qualifier, of course, right in the text is the word illegitimately. You can't illegitimately harm someone's good name, but there might be a legitimate reason to put some restrictions. So you think of maybe sex offender registries, or you think of even just prisoners or people that might be a danger or harm to society. So there can be reasons why we can maybe speak something that may be damaging a person's reputation, but it's not illegitimate. There might be a reason based in the common good why this needs to happen. And then I think the second sort of qualifier would actually be Canon 223, which is sort of just a couple of canons later. Again, it's in this whole section on the rights and obligations of all the faithful. And Canon 223 says this: in exercising their rights, the Christian faithful, both as individuals and gathered together in associations, must take into account the common good of the church, the rights of others, and their own duties towards others. So even as we have all these rights enumerated, including this right to intimacy, this right to not having our good name harmed, there's many other rights as well listed there, that we view those in connection with the rights of other people, and we also view it especially in connection with the common good. And so that idea of the common good, again, another theme from the council, right? This idea of communio, sort of all of these goods coming together. And furthermore, the second paragraph there in 223 says that the ecclesiastical authority can direct the exercise of rights in view of the common good. So it's kind of a very broad canon, but it allows, I think, bishops especially, for example, this is one of the canons we use, if a priest maybe hasn't committed a crime per se that's punishable, maybe with, dismissal from the clerical state, but yet he's maybe not assignable for some reason because of other boundary violations that maybe aren't technically crimes. A bishop could use this canon 223 to say, I'm just not going to give you an assignment right now, or you need to have some kind of maybe restricted ministry that's going to make sure we put up proper boundaries in view of the common good. So it may not be something that rises to the level of dismissal or maybe a severe punishment in a canonical process, and yet at the same time, the bishop may not have confidence that the common good would actually be respected if this man were serving in a parish or something like that. And so my point is that all of these can be moderated in view of the greater good. At the same time, we need to have a reason if we're going to be kind of pricing into what some of these rights are. Okay, does that all kind of make sense? All right, so now let's kind of shift to number 2 here, which would be just some history. And mainly there's going to be, I'm going to kind of go through some documents, but I'm trying to illustrate, maybe to give you kind of the main point here, is that the church has shifted, at least from my kind of study of this, from a very restrictive view of the use of psychology to a much broader. And I think we'll kind of reflect it as we just kind of do this kind of quick historical survey. So kind of a very cautious approach and almost suspicion of psychology, and now very much, I think, to sort of embracing it, again, within proper constraints and making sure that certain principles are observed. So that's kind of the main. I also mentioned here, I think online, I don't think we handed out, but there's a bibliography, I think in the additional resources on the website. So if you want to see some more reading, you can take a look at that. So let's take a look here at some of this history here. Prior to the council, the church began to articulate some caution around the use of psychological testing. And so one of the earliest things we have was from Pope Pius XII. There was an international congress on psychotherapy and clinical psychology, and he affirmed the value of psychology and the psychological sciences, but also expressed reservations around protecting the freedom of the subject, of the individual. There was always, again, and I think we still have that kind of concern. We want to make sure that if somebody's receiving or undergoing psychological therapy or counseling, that their freedom is being respected, not being sort of coerced into some kind of a treatment that they're not desiring. Several years later, in 1961, under John the 23rd, there was a little more clear warning, a monitum, we call it, about psychological testing, especially around candidates for priesthood and religious life. And so it said that there is value for psychological testing, but that the priest or religious themselves should not undergo psychoanalysis unless the ordinary himself permits it for a grave reason. So it was actually kind of a general prohibition. You're really not supposed to undergo this, but the ordinary can give it if there's a grave reason. So again, kind of a very kind of a cautious approach to it. I think some of the reason around that, and again, this is really my field, but doing some reading on this was kind of the time when Freud is writing, and there's just a different psychological kind of schools of thought that would be incompatible sort of with our Christian anthropology. I think we've grown a lot, I think, and now we've got beautiful examples of deeply Catholic and faithful therapists and counselors. But sort of, again, back in the early days here when this was all kind of very new, there was a suspicion that maybe some of the anthropological understandings that are being pushed here are actually incompatible with our understanding of the human person. And so it kind of makes sense that the Vatican would be fairly cautious at the beginning. We also see here that the UN got involved, and they had another one of their departments, the Council on Sociology and Economics, was concerned about coerced treatments and things like lie detector tests or other kinds of invasive sort of testing that would maybe violate the freedom of individuals. And so the church was concerned about that. And then finally, this kind of sort of all came to a head in 1976 with the Secretary of State. And he sent out this bulletin, this nota indicativa, an instruction to all the diplomatic representatives around the world. And this is really significant because it actually, the principles he came up with, and I'm not sure if he wrote it himself or there was a group, but it was under his name. We still use sort of these three principles today, and we find almost the same language kind of working into some of our documents today. So he also referenced the UN Declaration on Human Rights. He said that there are many abuses, above all in novitiates and seminaries, in order to obtain a manifestation of conscience with projective psychological methods or other means. And kind of a concern that maybe some of the testing was maybe being too invasive, and there was a lack of freedom on the part of the subject or the candidate. So he gives these three criteria. One, there must be a prior, explicit, informed, and absolutely free consent of the candidates. Without free consent, the psychologist cannot disclose to a third person what he or she has concluded. So think of today how we need to have permissions and we need to have disclosures. We need to be able to, men have to agree to have the results be shared. So there has to be some kind of written permission there. And then finally, the psychologist is bound by the principles of morality regarding secrets held. So, stuff revealed in confidence can't be used against the person, couldn't be used in a way that would, somehow harm them. That is only ordered towards the person's good. This isn't going to be used as some kind of, information that you could use against the person to sort of extract something, or and that kind of makes sense. So these are really kind of the principles that he articulated that we still find in documents today. We kind of keep going here. In 1965, this was a little bit earlier than that 76 note, but it was sort of from the Vatican II, only mentions psychological testing in passing. I mean, it was very, very brief. And then also the 1970 would have been the first ratio following the council that we had. And again, kind of a very brief treatment in that first ratio. It says that somebody could get psychological testing, but again, it was only to be done with sort of this idea of a grave reason or permission of the ordinary. And so it was a rather sort of cautious approach to it, although it was possible. And now if you kind of flip, now we kind of shift here, we now have the 83 code. And now we begin to see, I think, kind of this broadening of this. And so one thing we notice in the code is that we find that psychic health, that term comes up in numerous canons. Canon 241 says that a candidate for major seminary has to have the adequate physical and psychic health, has other things as well, but that's named sort of as a specific requirement for the person. If you go to the canons on holy orders, it comes up 3 or 4 times against psychic health. So the church is now kind of saying, we need to know that this is there in order to proceed, because this is an important qualification here for ordination. In 1992, we had PPF 4. So when I was in seminary, this was the document that was sort of the one that we were using. It also had a little more positive tone about psychological testing, but it did add some more restrictions and qualifications about how to keep confidential the records of seminarians. Again, things that we would all be doing, I think, now pretty regularly, but it made that point. And then we do find a little interesting shift here in points number 3, which would be almost a regression, you might say, at least in terms of this general pattern, which this document 2004 was titled The Directory for Pastoral Ministry of Bishops. It was a document of the Congregation, now Dicastery for Bishops. And so it's kind of a large instruction, and it's kind of sort of helping bishops in their overall pastoral ministry. And there's a section in there around seminaries and seminarians. And it says that a bishop should assess the psychic health of the candidate. So again, taking this from the council and from the 83 code, we want to make sure a man has good psychic health. But then it says that this referring a man to a psychologist for testing can only occur if the case warrants it. Si casus ferat, only if it's, in other words, the norm would be we don't refer to sort of formal testing, but if a case warrants it, then the bishop could permit that to happen. So again, it's a little bit of the opposite direction, because earlier we've been kind of seeing this more broader trend. Now suddenly in 2004, the norm would be no, but if the case warrants it, it would be permitted. And here's the quote: "The complex and difficult situation of young people in today's world requires that the bishop be particularly attentive in assessing candidates at the time of their admission to seminary. In some difficult cases, when selecting candidates for admission, it will be appropriate to ask them to undergo psychological testing, but only si casus ferat, if the case warrants it, because recourse to such means cannot be generalized and must be undertaken with the greatest prudence so as not to violate the person's right to privacy." So again, here's the canon we just talked about. So somehow the bishop is supposed to assess this, but generally he's not actually supposed to refer them to testing unless the case warrants it. So it's more of a what would I say, just kind of more of an exception. However, a year later, this is kind of where you wonder if the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. A year later, we get PPF 5, which at the time, like all the PPFs, has the force of particular law in that country. And that didn't say for a particular case, it said it's an integral part of the admissions process. So a psychological assessment is an integral part of the admission procedure. And I go on here with the rest of the quote. So there's nothing here that would seem to suggest only in a serious case, only if the bishop gives permission, only if the case warrants it. So just 1 year later, we have kind of back to kind of our more open-ended and more sort of positive tone towards psychology. Let's see. There's another interesting line here. I don't know if I put it on your notes in PPF 5. And again, PPF 5 isn't what we have now. But it does bring up this question of the internal-external fora. And it's one of the few places in PPF 5 where this is addressed. And so it speaks about integral testing. It speaks, paragraph 57, about how we're to keep the files confidential and safeguarding of files. And then it has this line in there, and there's no explanation for the line at all. And I think it's very unhelpful. The traditional distinction between internal and external forum is to be maintained. So it's one sentence tucked in with the thing around psychology, no definition of the terms, doesn't say what the traditional distinction is. And again, it's kind of odd because in the paragraph on psychology wouldn't be the place I would think that we would sort of address internal, external force. I'll talk a little bit later about that in a moment of how that's been shifted now in PPF 6. We have a much clearer understanding. But that was all that PPF 5 said about it. And it was kind of tucked into this little section about safeguarding psychological records. In 2008, we now kind of seem to go back again. So here we have the Vatican Instruction Guidelines for the Use of Psychology. And this comes from the Vatican Congregation for Education, and it goes back to what the Congregation of Bishops said 4 years earlier, and mentions, again, si casus ferat, that is in exceptional cases that present particular difficulties. Recourse to experts in psychological sciences, both before admission to the seminary and during the path of formation, can help the candidate overcome those psychological wounds and interiorize in an even more stable and profound way the type of life shown by Jesus, the Good Shepherd, head and bridegroom. So again, now we're kind of going the other way. It's exceptional cases. It's only if there's certain difficulties, then it could happen. And then once again, we have PPF 6, which now just reaffirms PPF 5 almost verbatim, and repeats it once again that this is now an integral part of the admissions procedure. And so we're kind of left with maybe a conundrum here. So how do we resolve the tension between two Vatican instructions that have a very restrictive view, and then our own particular law that says it's an integral part and it is to happen in every case? So anyone want to opine on what do we do if you're a canonist and you're trying to solve this? Yeah.
I think we have to wait, right? I think we have to.
Okay, another question. Okay, no, so you have to wait. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
I think we have to wait because every 2 years we come out with a new. So in 2020.
Yeah. Really. Exactly. Yeah. Right. Wait for the next PPF for the next. Actually, the answer is even a little simpler, which is that the general norms in the code, and I don't have the canon in front of me here, but it talks about what is an instruction. So a directory, when you see directory on this, directory on that, those are what's called instructions. And instructions in canon law are to help further elucidate and explain how to implement law, but they're not law themselves. And so there's a clear hierarchy. Law comes first, and instruction is subordinate to the law. It helps us interpret and apply the law in particular cases. So the short answer is you follow the law, and the law we have is PPF was 5, now it's PPF 6. So, I mean, that's the resolution, is we follow what's law, and if an instruction doesn't harmonize with the law, well, then we just kind of ignore that part of it because it's not harmonized. Again, the church is big and there's different congregations and there's different people doing different things, but we're obliged to follow the law. And PPF 6, by the way, wasn't just our bishops, but it also went to Rome and it got the recognition from the Congregation for Clergy. So in a sense, you've got clergy taking this and saying this is law, and then you've got bishops and you've got education. It's kind of for them to figure out, but our job is really to follow what is law for our country. And so I think we can be at peace and follow, what PPF tells us to do. So, and I would say these are also outliers. If you look at the general kind of trend, as I've been kind of giving, those would be a little bit of the outliers. And again, we don't want to just treat them as if the whole document isn't helpful, but there's going to be things that come up that don't really harmonize very well. And so that's why we also have a code to tell us what ranks higher and what is to give us confidence. So we follow what is the law. And the other piece I'd say, PPF 6 went beyond PPF 5. While PPF 5 said it's an integral part, PPF 6 also expands who has access or who can benefit from this. So it added this line: at times, formators may need to work with the seminarian on matters related to the evaluation, and thus they will need some knowledge of the assessment. So that's the first time that we've had a PPF that has sort of broadened, instead of just being a tool to make sure someone's not crazy to get in the seminary, but now it can actually be something that can be a place of growth. And the formator himself may have some access to the assessment. Maybe he doesn't get the whole thing, and this is what we try to do at the St. Paul Seminary. So one of the kind of our practices now is sometime in the first semester, the seminarian will meet with one of our staff psychologists. We've got a good team of psychologists. You'll meet some of them, I think, in the next module. Paul Ruff is our lead there. And then they'll present with the man and the formator kind of an abbreviated version of the psychological assessment. So it's not giving over to the formator the whole report from the psychologist, but it would be kind of a review of maybe what are some of the key points. And then there's a sort of a three-way conversation. And part of that is to help bring the formator up to speed, but it's also just to let the man be known. And then it can be a bit of a handoff so that if there were certain growth issues or personality things or stuff to be aware of, that's going to help fill out the picture. And the psychological report doesn't have to be the secret thing that nobody, that's just deep, dark secrets, but it's actually going to kind of be a tool of growth that can be used in a healthy way. John's got a question or some.
Yeah, Dr. Calraza does this here at St. Vincent's, but I find that the comment is this: I think the men themselves are extra appreciative that the seminary, like you just said, Father Joe, you know, a lot of times the seminarian doesn't, you take all these psychologicals,
Right.
and-
What's it for, and what
and,
happened
and
to
no
it?
one seems to have bridged it in the seminary. So what Carol does is it's the formation advisor, spiritual director, and herself, and then bridges.
Oh,
The
spiritual
seminarian
director.
gets
Now,
the
that's an
seminarian
interesting
gets to
piece.
hear the follow-up and
Yeah.
understand his own assessment that if that meeting didn't happen, no one ever has explained
Right,
it
that's
to
right.
him.
Yeah.
So it's really, I think what I'm trying to underlie is the seminarian's deep gratitude and appreciation that someone's taken the time to explain to them what they underwent,
That's right.
which is often difficult and hilarious at the
Yeah,
same
yeah.
time. I mean, when I was in the novitiate, it was a big skit about
The-
what everybody underwent in their psychologicals. You have to laugh about it, you know. So
Right.
anyway.
And I think, you know, for our guys too, it will often be a place then that maybe that begins for them a conversation, and they say, yeah, I'd like to meet with Paul or maybe one of the other counselors. You know, it may just be an opportunity to maybe even begin some kind of growth counseling, because it's now kind of out in the open and it's not a big scary thing, and it can give space for kind of that to breathe a little bit. So yes, sister.
In other words, it's a deprivation if the seminarian doesn't receive it.
That's right. Go ahead, sister.
I began doing psychological assessments for seminaries in 1984. And I can tell you that it has evolved tremendously over the years of what an assessor actually looks for. And early on, it was pretty basic. I think that, you know, some of this historical reflection of the church, where I think some of the times for seminaries, though you wouldn't do it with the general public, they more wanted you to speak about, you know, sexual activity or not. And so it became almost invasive in that sense. And that was an issue. And then over time, I think that when we're looking more at what is more appropriate, now when you look at the years of commenting of what you need to look at in a psychological assessment, like in 1990, you know, it was just, again, just the sexual activity or the not, because of the secretiveness that of the double standard that occurred, you know. But now it's much more understood in those who assess, especially the psychologists, psychiatrists who are being formed in the faith, that the sexual person is their whole being. It's like it undergirds who they are, how they are humanly. It's part of their human formation. And that has then also been reflected on the questions that come up, the testing that comes up. So it's not just having to do with what they do sexually or not, but who they are as a man called probably, possibly to a spiritual fatherhood, which involves their whole person. And those questions now are in psychological assessments where they were not decades ago. So I think the caution in the church earlier on, I could understand because it was black or white. And as we've grown to get more comfortable with the human person and what we're really looking to in formation, it's the whole person. It's not part of a person. That really is a reduction of who we are in the beauty of how God created us. So I think that is why also the testing is more useful. And I think it's something that can benefit both the man and also the formator in that process, because it's about who they are as a human person and their totality, not just this piece of activity, which was before much more what was the focus in these assessments.
Great. Yeah. And we'll have another module too on psychology. So I think I'll kind of wrap up that and move on. My last maybe brief point would be, I mentioned that there was this odd sentence in PPF 5 about intellectual form tucked into the psychology section. That has been now removed happily in PPF 6. And so it's treated in a different way, which is kind of what I want to get to now. So kind of for our last 20 minutes here, let's dive into some comments here around the intellectual form. So, you know, there's I think there's a lot of confusion around this. And I think if I'm kind of happy to talk about this because I'd like to sort of go back to sort of the original meaning, because I think if we don't understand the original meaning of what the terms mean, then it's hard to get sort of how we use it today. But you hear these, I think when I was in seminary, I mean, if it was even talked about explicitly, it was like, yeah, internal forum is, you know, that's your spiritual director. That's kind of where you can say anything you want. An external forum is, be careful what you say. I mean, it was kind of, okay, like, but what do these words even mean? And that's kind of, and I think a lot of people would kind of say that. So kind of the first question is, but what is this referring to when people say the external forum of, I mean, to me, it seems like there's a word or two missing, right? And it's the form of governance. The original meaning of the term here is that this is a forum is a place. It's a Latin word for place, and it's a place of governance. So internal forum or external forum deals with the power of governance. So if we think here about the threefold mission of Christ, right? Christ came to teach, he came to sanctify, he came to govern. We also think about in law, there's legislative power, there's judicial power, and there's executive power. So kind of three kinds of bishops possess all three of these different kinds of power. Depending on other roles you may have. When I was vicar for clergy, I exercised executive power of governance. When I was judicial vicar, I had judicial power of governance. Only bishops have legislative power of governance. But these are all kind of words dealing with the place where this kind of power of governance is exercised. If you've ever been to I'm sure you've been to ancient Rome and you walked around, the Colosseum, well, here's the Roman Forum, right? This was where the government met. This is kind of where the Senate met and where there would be law giving and speeches. And so it really goes back to that place in the open space or marketplace where that's where we get the term in Roman law here of this. So the Druidic Forum, if we're going to kind of map this out here, and then we can divide it here into external forum or internal. And then this one can become sacramental internal forum or non-sacramental. So that's kind of the original kind of understanding with these terms. It's dealing with the places of where power of governance is exercised. As I mentioned, a priest, a deacon, a bishop, a cleric in the church has, depending on one's role or what's delegated and what their office is, has power of governance. So that's going to be, again, different than maybe legislative or judicial power, but we're talking about the executive power of governance. And there are some acts which clearly pertain to the external form. Again, I'm talking here more of the original meaning of this term, and then we'll talk about sort of how that shifted over time to our current understanding. But these would be acts of governance that are public, that need to be known by sort of everybody. So when a bishop appoints a man a pastor, there's a decree written, it's printed in the Catholic newspaper, it's maybe read at the parish, there's the installation. This is a very sort of public external act of governance, the appointment of a pastor. If a vicar general maybe dispenses in a marriage, you're a pastor, and depending on your rules in your chancery, maybe you have a unbaptized person wanting to marry Catholic, and you need to write the chancery to get dispensation. The vicar general or somebody delegated the chancellor would dispense exercising this power of governance in the external forum, permitting this marriage to happen between a Catholic and an unbaptized person. The internal forum is not going to be public in that sense. It's going to be something very private. It's going to be something very personal. It's going to be something which is not sort of pertaining to the public good, but something rather that is very private and individual. But again, in the original sense of the term here, this is a place, the internal forum is still where governance happens. So what's an example of act of governance in the sacramental form, meaning in confession, would be the remission maybe of the penalty of excommunication. So the person who commits abortion and they come to confession, again, depending on Pope Francis is now widened this, but at least in the original understanding, there had to be a special faculty to remit the penalty, not so much to absolve the sin, but there was in addition to the sin, There's also the addition of the penalty of excommunication. And so when the confessor, he can remit in the sacramental internal forum the penalty of excommunication. That's an act of governance, which is different than the sacramental act of absolving, which comes from his power of orders. An example maybe in the non-sacramental internal forum might be, let's say that a seminarian and his spiritual director, not in the context of confession, but the seminarian reveals maybe the same thing. Maybe he was a participant in an abortion years ago and he had, facilitated an abortion. It wasn't in the context of confession that he told the spiritual director this, but now the spiritual director is aware that there may be canonical penalties. There also might be an irregularity in exercise orders. The spiritual director can have access to the apostolic penitentiary in Rome for the remission of those canonical penalties, and that would be an act of governance in the juridic forum in the non-sacramental way. So the original kind of sense here always dealt with acts of governance and where those acts happen. Do they happen externally, visibly, known to all? Do they happen more privately, internally, whether that be in confession or whether that be in the context of spiritual direction or outside the confessional itself? That's not how we use it today, right? I mean, I think very few people would probably go to this. So there has been a big shift, and I think a big widening in these terms today. And I don't really know how it happened, other than I think it's just that over time, I think we began to associate, because of the connection between a priest and a confessor, we would sort of say, well, this is internal, and this is the bishop, or this is somebody external. And so we kind of began to sort of apply these terms almost to everything, internal, external, whether or not it actually dealt with an act of power of governance. And so we do say, for example, very clearly that a confessor and spiritual director is in the internal forum, and we would say very clearly that formation faculty happens in the external forum. There are, interestingly, that these terms, if you try to look in the Code of Canon Law for this broader understanding, it's not really listed. But there are, again, places where this is implicit. For example, there's a canon that prohibits the rector of a seminary to hear the confessions of the seminarians. So it's kind of rooted in this idea that a rector is going to be on the external forum, and so therefore, generally speaking, he's not going to be able to hear confessions. Now, if somebody's in danger of death or there's some other urgent need, I would say, any priest should be generous. But generally speaking, right, when the rector is not going to be the ordinary confessor at a seminary. Similarly, Canon 240, paragraph 2 talks about the process of evaluation of seminarians, and it prohibits explicitly administrators and the seminary rectors and such from seeking the opinion of spiritual directors on the candidates. And so I think we all observe this in our seminaries. We may have review meetings, and maybe the spiritual director is a silent participant, but he's not going to be voicing opinions because we just understand that there is this distinction in the roles. So again, that's kind of the original meeting, the expanded meeting, and then this becomes then to roll out maybe somewhat inadequately over the years, but I think we're getting better at it in our documents. And so just a kind of a quick review here. PPF 5, again, had that odd line that it mentioned the traditional distinction in the context of psychology, but never explained what it was. It also, paragraph 80 in PPF 5, similarly, that we've talked about here, that formation advisors or directors are in the external forum, spiritual directors are in the internal forum. Paragraph 134 says the content of what a seminarian discloses in spiritual direction belongs to the internal forum, and the spiritual director may neither reveal it nor use it. In the ratio in 2016, it only uses the term internal forum once, and it doesn't ever define what the terms are. So it says the spiritual director is in the internal forum. It doesn't really mention where the external formator is, and nor does it actually define either of those terms. And then finally, in 2019, I think we have the best example that I could find of where the church has kind of now sort of put pen to paper and given sort of this expanded meaning. And I put the quote here. It's kind of long, but I'll just go ahead and read it to you. So this is on a document from the Apostolic Penitentiary on the internal forum, but it begins to sort of describe that this narrower sense of what it is, and then also the expanded sense of spiritual direction. The juridical moral sphere of the internal forum also includes a so-called extra-sacramental internal forum, always concealed but external to the sacrament of penance. In it, too, the church exercises her mission and saving authority, not by forgiving sins, but by giving graces, breaking juridical constraints such as censures, caring for all that concerns the sanctification of souls, and therefore the proper, intimate, and personal sphere of each believer. In a particular way, the spiritual direction in which the individual faithful entrusts his own path of conversion and sanctification to a specific priest, consecrated, or layperson belongs to the internal extra-sacramental forum. In the spiritual direction, the believer freely reveals his conscience. In his conscience is secret to the spiritual director or guide in order to be oriented and supported in listening and in fulfilling the will of God. Thus, the particular area also demands a certain secrecy ad extra, inherent to the content of spiritual colloquies and deriving from each person's right to the respect of his or own privacy. So there's our friend, again, Canon 220. This is also the first time that I found that non-clergy are listed as in the internal forum. So it mentions specifically a layperson or consecrated religious can serve as a spiritual director, and that is in this non-sacramental internal forum. So again, a bit of an expansion here, not just from those who have power of governance, which would generally be seen as clergy, but now this says here in that context, it may be a priest, a consecrated, or a layperson who functions here in that non-sacramental internal forum. And then I think when we get to PPF 6, and here I gave out these little handouts here, so take a look at these when you get a moment. And these are just kind of helpful. These are sort of, I don't remember when these came out, but when the new PPF was coming out, the CCLV, I think it was from CCLV, published, I call them like bulletin inserts. And we shared these with all of our formators and folks in the seminary. But these are two in particular that deal with this topic, and specifically issue number 8. So I gave issue 14 and issue number 8, but issue number 8 especially I think is very good here. And I'm very grateful because I think PPF 6 does a much more thorough job in explaining what this means. So again, PPF 5 didn't really give us much detail at all on what this is, but PPF 6 talks about this expanded notion of internal external fora in the context of relationships. And I think that's very helpful. This is paragraphs 93 to 95. And so what we're really dealing with here is relationships. It's not, again, the original was place of acts of governance. The broader is more relationships. And what are the relationships the seminarian has? In the external forum, that would be his bishop, the rector, the vice rector, other external formators. In the internal forum, of course, it would be a relationship between a spiritual director and a confessor. And then the PPF 6 begins to describe the matter that is appropriate to each relationship. And so again, you can take a look here at maybe look at issue 8. And I think if you flip here on the second page there, the last paragraph here on issue number 8. So this begins to address sort of what is the matter? What is it that is being discussed or presented? While the manifestation of conscience and sacramental confession are never part of the external forum, over time, the seminarian will grow comfortable discussing appropriate interior matters related to his vocation with formators in the external forum. A solid relationship of trust with his formators in both fora will benefit the seminarian as he receives guidance from all formators. These relationships will allow major decisions to be reached following regular discussions throughout the formation process, so the seminarian will not be surprised by decisions reached by those responsible for his formation and vice versa. And so I think maybe the main point here would be, we don't want a man to feel like he has to be divided in himself. It's not that, okay, I'm one seminarian and I have half of me goes here and half of me goes here. He's one man, and he's an integral whole, and he's got a lot going on inside of him. He has different relationships, a relationship with the spiritual director, a relationship with the formator, a relationship with a rector and a professor. And there are certain constraints around these different relationships, but the man himself is just the man. The people who have to really pay attention to the relationships are those in those various roles. And so this afternoon, I'll break that down more specifically. What are the responsibilities of the spiritual director and of the formator and of the rector? We're the ones who have to be responsible for the constraints and setting the proper boundaries in our roles. It's not the seminarian. The seminarian is just a man who wants to be known. and we're the ones who need to kind of stay in our lane, but not draw such a strict, you know, bind it up so tightly that the man feels like he can only share part of himself in this and part of himself with somebody else. So we need to begin kind of teaching the man around that and what that kind of looks like. So again, I'll get more detailed this afternoon, but the point is we are in internal external fora depending on our role and our assignment. The man himself is just a man, and we want to encourage him to be known in appropriate ways. And it's really ultimately going to be his choice what he chooses to share. And as this paragraph says here, over time, as trust is being built, he's going to be willing to share more of himself in the external formation. And that's going to be a good thing, not because it's dangerous or we're the bad cops trying to get the guy, but there are things that can be resolved in the external forum in a way that couldn't be resolved in the internal forum. And again, I'll give you more examples this afternoon. So I know we're just about at time. Maybe there's one or two questions now, and then we'll take a break and have a chance for the three of us. So yes, you want to get the... I think it was right here. Yeah, Father Michael.
All the documents I'm aware of, so from the Vatican, also from the ratio in Australia, the ratio here in the States, all of them indicate that the identifier is a better word, identify that among those who should be on the informed consent to receive a copy of the psych report is the Director of Spiritual Formation. The person on our faculty who fulfills that role, I've always respected his request. He's asked not to receive a copy of the psych report. Now, I can't force him to do that, and I would never be wanting to, given that that's what he said. I have found myself various times, though, at least giving him a bit of a synopsis of the recommendations that the psychologist might provide at the end of the report. But what's your take on this when it comes to someone fulfilling the role of spiritual director in terms of his access to the report, and to what extent perhaps he might need to be abreast of the content of the report?
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of struck when Carol said that here at St. Vincent de Paul, that the spiritual directors, because I know our practice has been the formator, the man himself, and the psychologist. I kind of like the idea. I mean, that's something we'll bring back and discuss back at our place. But I think it might help. Again, not that the spiritual director is a psychologist, but for him just to kind of have a sense of what are going to be some of these human issues. Now, his role again is to really be. I think Bishop talked about this last night. It's going to be helping the man stay deeply in communion with Christ. It's really not to be sort of pay attention to all four dimensions of formation. But nonetheless, I think if it's helpful to the spiritual director, I wouldn't see a problem, again, if the man consents to it, you know. So I would mention too that I should say, just because something is in the external forum, while in the governance thing that's very public, it doesn't mean that it's everything, you know. I'm in the external forum. I know a lot of things that are confidential, right? So external doesn't mean public necessarily. There are still rules of confidentiality. And I think we all understand that. I think even as we're dealing with an external forum, there may be things you need to share with the rector or share with somebody in proper authority or the man's bishop. It doesn't mean you just, you know, tell the brother priests and just chat about guys. So we really want to reverence these relationships. It doesn't mean that it's public. It still may be confidential, but it means it may be used, again, if somebody has a right to know and a need to know for the good of the man. That's kind of what we're getting at here. So we still, and certainly with psychology, we'll talk about this again next module and a little this afternoon, but the psychologist is in the external forum. I think sometimes people think a psychologist is in the internal forum. Not the case. It's always in the external forum, but yet confidential, has its own rules of confidentiality. Okay, maybe we'll take a break there and we'll come back at 10:15. Is that right, Father John? Okay.